Well, this is the last video podcast, so I'm going to try to cover a bunch of the requests that I couldn't fit into the other episodes. This is a question I got a lot. All of the textures were made in Photoshop, and the pigeon was actually done from scratch. I started off with the UVs and made a brush in Photoshop that uses the color dynamics. Now, I'm using a Wacom tablet, so when I press hard, it's dark, but when I press lightly, it's white. So when you make quick little strokes, you get a little bit of variation in the feathers, and then you just paint them in like shingles. Now, the other thing people comment on quite a bit is the neck. Some pigeons have these iridescent feathers, and the color is based on the angle. So in the material, I used an incidence node. That way, the shallower the angle is from the surface to the camera, the more purple it becomes, but straight-on angles are green, and it changes as things move. Then, I just used an extra specular node as a matte, so the effect only happens when it's getting hit by direct light. The next one is another big request I got. Now, I don't draw very well, so I pulled favors from friends, but because they were doing it in their spare time, I couldn't always get complete orthographics. So, for the Pigeon and Walter, I took whatever reference I had and did the designs directly in 3D. Now, unfortunately, I deleted the curves after I was done, so I can't show them, but this is a character for an upcoming short that I'm doing the exact same way. Basically, I'll do a front view and a side view with curves. And then, once I'm happy with those views, I'll go into 3D and start massaging the curves into a cage that you can spin around. The great thing about this is that you can start to see volumes and how it works in 3D, but it's just curves, so it's really easy to change things until you're happy. Then I start to build the geometry out using edge modeling. From what I understand, most people doing characters tend to work this way. It's just like box modeling, only instead of extruding polygons, you just extrude the edges. And that gives you a lot more control, especially when you're doing something like a face where you need to be really careful where your lines go. And that leads perfectly into the next question about facial rigging. There's a great book called Stop Staring by Jason Osipa, and this is pretty much the Bible for facial rigging. I don't want to steal his ideas and pass them off as my own, so go get the book. But that said, there are two cool tricks I've picked up that aren't in his book. First off, I rely a lot on the eyes of a character when I'm animating, so one thing I modified from the stop staring setup is to add in 12 controls around each eye, and this lets you sculpt the eyelid, which might seem like a subtle thing, but when you're doing cartoony animation, you can get a lot out of tweaking the shapes of the eyes. Another trick is one I figured out pretty recently, so it's not in the short, but I put it on every rig I do now, and this is a sculpt control. What this is a lattice that's parented to the head control. Now, the cool thing about lattices is that they only deform when you move one of the control points. If you just move the lattice itself, nothing happens, unless of course you've got a point that's not zeroed out, and then moving the lattice will cause the deformation to swim over the geometry, which is actually a pretty neat effect on its own. Now, what's cool about this sculpt control is it's basically a wild card for the animator. Say you're animating and you want to wiggle the nose, but there's not a control for it. Well, you just move the sculpt control over the nose and use that to animate with. Question number 4, soft shadows. On PI, we used area lights. Now, the reason that worked, though, is because of our multipass technique. The shadow pass was kind of heavy, but everything was a flat white material, so it really wasn't that bad. However, I have picked up another trick that's worth mentioning. Say that this is a huge environment that's lit by the sun. You want to have soft shadows, but area lights won't render because the scene is too huge. And there's no way you can light an area this big with a shadow map because the map would have to be several gigabytes just to get you enough resolution. Now, what you can do instead is something I call a donut light. How it works is you use a spotlight as the sun and turn on ray traced shadows. Then you duplicate that light and make it negative so it's sucking the light away from the scene. If you make the angle of the cone really small, what you get will be something like this. Now, duplicate that negative light and make it positive again and turn on shadow maps. Now what you see is we've got shadows on the entire scene, but we can specify the area that we want to do the shadow mapping on. So you can put it wherever it's most important to get those soft shadows, and you can also make it as large as you need to, as long as you don't start running into memory issues with your shadow map. Number 5. Yeah, the camera is pretty important to me. Probably the best bit of advice I have is to go out and shoot some stuff in the real world and try to get comfortable with how an actual camera works, especially how focal length and depth of field work together. Now, I like to be pretty realistic with my camera moves, so sometimes I'll even go so far as to build a digital camera rig that mimics the equipment you'd use on a live action set. Now, it might seem kind of silly to limit yourself like that, but it can actually add a lot of production value because those big swooping CG camera moves have a tendency to look really fake. One other thing I sometimes do is that if you want a handheld look, just take a real camera and do the move. Then use a camera tracking program like PF Track or Syntheyes. There's even an open source program called Voodoo, and those programs can recreate the camera move in 3D, so it feels extremely realistic and has that nice handheld sense of spontaneity. The last little camera tip I have is actually more of a mistake I see quite a bit. And that is because it's CG, the tendency is to try to make every single camera move perfect. But in the real world, there's a cameraman following the action, so it's never perfect. In fact, usually the camera is lagging just a little bit behind the motion, so when you're animating it, it helps to just offset that animation by a few frames. Number 6. This is another one that's probably worth mentioning a book for. Film Directing Shot by Stephen Katz. A lot of film students have this book because it does a really good job of laying down some guidelines. A few other things I will say, though, is that I found 2D storyboards to work best for the slower acting shots because you can get a lot more detail and nuance, but 3D layout, animatic style stuff usually tends to work best for action scenes because it shows movement and pacing a lot more clearly. Now, one other tip I have on action sequences is that, to me, they can get confusing very easily. So what I like to do is something called motivating the cut. The way it works is I never cut to something new without refocusing the audience's attention first. Sometimes it's as simple as panning towards what's happening in the next shot, or if you're on a reaction shot, you can have the character look at it, and then add a little whip pan or a crash zoom to make it clear that you're following the gaze of the character. And if you keep doing that every time you cut, your action sequences will feel really smooth and fluid, and you can cut around a lot without confusing the audience. Now, there's one last tip that I have, and I saved it until the end because this is probably the most important tip that I have to offer. It's something my friends and I call sass. All that is a word we use to mean constructive criticism. On PI, I would screen the animatic about once a month, and people would tear it apart and give notes. Now, I can't believe how many filmmakers don't do this because it makes such a huge difference. What you need to do is to find some filmmakers whose opinions you trust. Not friends and family, because they need to know how to make movies. They need to be able to pick apart your movie, and they can't be afraid to tell you when they see something that's wrong. That's the trifecta of a good sasser. Now, the next step is probably the hardest part. You need to listen to what they say. I know that seems like common sense, but when you're getting notes on something that you spent a lot of time and put a lot of love into, the natural instinct is almost always to fight the notes. But you can't just throw up your hands and say, no, this is perfect, this is exactly what I want, because that's how most bad movies get made. Now, that said, sometimes the notes will seem crazy. For instance, early on in the story process for PI, the briefcase was malfunctioning and the pigeon never got inside it. He was just a side character. One of the notes was to cut either the briefcase or the pigeon. Now, the point is that you don't necessarily have to use the solution that's offered, but most of the time if someone says that you should try doing something, it's because there's an underlying problem that's not working with the story. In that case, the underlying problem was that there were two antagonists, and so putting the pigeon inside the briefcase reconciled it and had the effect of turning it into a single antagonist. So sometimes you just have to read between the lines, because a lot of times that's the form that notes come in. Well, I've had a great time doing these podcasts. I hope you've enjoyed them. As I mentioned last week, the Pigeon Impossible DVD is available. You can pick it up through the website. It includes a few special features that you can't see anywhere else, as well as all 23 podcast episodes. And speaking of that, the last 2 episodes are now online, but you'll have to go to the Pigeon Impossible website to see them because they're longer and they're audio only, so I couldn't upload them to YouTube. Well, I guess that's it for the Pigeon Impossible podcast. Thanks for watching.